anybody else in the world is because we've been pro-Israel. OPEC right now blackmails the world by giving a better oil contract to those who will be anti-Israel. It's all about that little piece of land, about 200 miles long and 50 miles across. They claim that the promise of that land was given to Ishmael and his descendants and not to Isaac and his descendants. The Apostle Paul tells us that through Hagar, Ishmael's descendants would birth a religion of bondage from the desert of Arabia. This religion is called Islam. The word Islam means submission or bondage. You can read this in Galatians chapter 4, verse 21 through 25. Since Islam, the harlot, helped the Antichrist rise to power through peaceful means during the first half of the 7-year tribulation, he's willing to share his power and glory with her. However, after he's had his way with her and used her for his own selfish purposes, he takes over control of her and her assets. He molests the harlot, in other words. He completely destroys her. Secular Babylon the Great destroys religious Babylon the Great. So we have the harlot identified and destroyed. Now, stay with me. Chapter 18, we see the judgment of secular Babylon. Chapter 17, we saw the judgment and destruction of religious Babylon. Verse 1, after these things I saw another angel coming down from heaven having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. So God sends another angel to inform the world of the total destruction of Babylon. This angel has so much power and authority that his glory lights up the whole world. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, and has become a habitation of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. The fall of Babylon is the first mention, I think it was first mentioned back in Revelation chapter 14, verse 8, when one of the gospel angels, remember, is preaching to the whole world that Babylon is going to fall. The bottomless pit is the place for the inhabitants of demons, but after the destruction of Islam, the kingdom of the Antichrist will be invaded by demons and all kinds of ungodly spirits. It will be like hell on earth. For all the nations, verse 3, have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her. How do you do that? If you follow Islam, you're committing spiritual fornication, spiritual adultery. And the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. I do not know of a country in the world that has benefited directly or even indirectly from the luxury of oil more so than the Middle East. Many countries have become rich dealing in oil. OPEC, that's the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries. This will be magnified during the tribulation. Most of the nations of the world will become intoxicated with the necessity of oil during the tribulation. Many nations of the world are already committing spiritual fornication by selling out Israel over their need for oil. When the Antichrist gets control of the big oil companies, especially OPEC, he will be able to use oil to bribe the countries that he needs to support him. I don't know why some folk get so upset at big oil companies. I'm going to tell you something. There's less than 50% of the oil that goes for energy. Over 50% of the oil goes to make makeup for you women. Make footballs, football helmets, golf balls. I have a list of 1,000 things that comes from petroleum. Less than 50% goes for energy. Over 50% goes for anything that's synthetic, anything that's any kind of plastic. And when the Antichrist controls the oil, it's not only the energy that he controls about every manufacturing company in the world. I heard another voice, verse 4, from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, unless you receive of her plagues. For in her sins Her sins have been revealed. They've reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquity. Sin always has consequences. Render to her just as she renders to you, and repay her double according to her works. The cup which she has mixed double for her. In the measure that she glorified herself and lived luxuriously, in the same measure give her torment and sorrow. For she says in her heart, I sit as a queen, and I'm no widow, and I will not see sorrow. No widow. I think that just simply means she thinks she has worldwide support, is too large and powerful to fall, and no one will abandon her. Therefore, verse 8, her plagues, the disasters, will come in one day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be utterly burned with fire, for strong is the Lord God who judges her. Now, chapter 17, we saw Islam, the false religion, identified and destroyed. Right now, we're seeing the secular Babylon identified and destroyed. And the kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived luxuriously with her will weep and lament for her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at a distance for fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, that great city, Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour judgment has come. Verse 11, and the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, for no one buys their merchandise anymore. Merchandise of gold and silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, and scarlet, every kind of citron wood, every kind of object of ivory, every kind of object of most precious wood, bronze, iron, and marble, and cinnamon, and incense, fragrant oil, and frankincense, wine, and oil, fine flour, and wheat, and sheep, horses, chariots, that'd be automobiles, and bodies and souls of men. These last two verses gives us a list of the merchandise that this great city imports in for their pleasure. The countries that have been providing these imports are weeping and wailing for their great loss. The bodies and souls of men refer to the slave trade of the Middle East, especially Saudi Arabia, where they import men, women, boys, and girls for the purpose of sex in order to support their decadent lifestyle. Verse 14, and the fruit that your soul longed for has gone from you, and all the things which are rich and splendid have gone from you, and you shall find them no more at all. The merchants of these things who became rich by her will stand at a distance for fear of her torment, weeping and wailing, and saying, Alas, alas, that great city that was clothed in fine linen, and purple and scarlet, and adorned with all kind of gold and precious stones and pearls. Now, this is a perfect description of how the king and the elite of Saudi Arabia and the Middle East dress as they flaunt their wealth. The Antichrist will be doing the same thing during the tribulation. He'll be flaunting his wealth, looking down his nose at the rest of mankind. Now, in the Middle East, those who have wealth wear their golden medallions with the crescent moon that we talked about, with a star. The poor wear their medallions made of seashells, rocks, wood, anything they can use to carve out a crescent moon with a star. Verse 17, for in 1 hour such great riches came to nothing, and every shipmaster, all who travel by ship, sailors, and as many as trade on the sea, stood at a distance. Many people in the Middle East will become rich and have become rich from the exporting of oil and the importing of the different kinds of merchandise we've just mentioned previously. Many merchants around the world become rich exporting luxury items. Now the importing and exporting business is going up in smoke. Even America will bite the dust without the oil from OPEC. During the tribulation, the Antichrist will be in control of the oil in the world, not just oil from OPEC. Keep in mind, by this time, the Antichrist has his empire under his control. He controls the automobile industry, the banks, the airlines, the shipping, the importing and exporting corporations, and most everything else, in addition to the oil and gas industry. Those responsible for running these businesses are, for the first time, beginning to suffer loss, and they don't like it, and they're weeping and wailing about it. Verse 18, they cried when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, what is like this great city? And they threw dust on their heads What group of people throws dust on their heads when they don't like something? And they threw dust on their heads and cried out, weeping and wailing and saying, Alas, alas, that great city in which all who had ships on the sea became rich by her wealth. For in 1 hour she is made desolate. Those who make their living by trading on the sea will be weeping and expressing their great sorrow by throwing dust on their heads. Now, throwing dust on their heads is just another expression of the Middle East that dates back to Ezekiel chapter 27, verse 30, and that's just another indication as to the identity of this great city. Verse 20, Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged on you. Remember those souls under the altar, those that got saved during the tribulation, but they were martyred, and they were fussing at Jesus and said, when are you going to put a stop to this? When are you going to put a stop to this carnage, this killing? Jesus told them to shut up and sit down, gave them a pacifier. Well, he didn't say it exactly that way, but we read it. We talked about it the other day. He gave them a robe to pacify them, told them to sit down, he'd get around to it. Well, he's getting around to it right here. Now, actually, what's taking place in chapter 17 and 18 happens during those 7 trumpets and those 7 bowls of the wrath of God. This is just giving us some details as to how all that was happening when the trumpets were blowing and when the bowls of the wrath of God's been poured out. Verse 21, Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great meteorite and threw it into the sea, saying, Thus with violence the city Babylon shall be thrown down and shall not be found anymore. An angel strong enough to throw a meteorite into the sea simply illustrates how swift and violent the judgment's going to be on Babylon. Now, I must tell you, the total destruction of commercial Babylon of the Antichrist will be literal, and it will be complete. All I know is whether it's a literal meteorite that's dropped into the sea, all it is saying, it simply illustrates how swift and violent the judgment is going to be on secular Babylon. I must tell you, the total destruction of commercial Babylon, the Antichrist empire, will be literal, and it will be complete. The sound of harpists, musicians, flutists, trumpeters shall not be heard anymore. No craftsman of any craft shall be found in you anymore. And the sound of a millstone shall not be heard in you anymore. And the light of a lamp, even all the electric companies go out of business. The light of a lamp shall not shine in you anymore. And the voice of the bridegroom, they're big on weddings in the Middle East. And the voice of the bridegroom in pride shall not be heard in you anymore. For your merchants were the great men of the earth, for by your sorcery, that is by your deception, all the nations were deceived. So all the utility providers are destroyed. There will be no electricity. The Middle East is known for their extravagant weddings. There'll be no marriages. This verse indicates that the business people of the world will realize that they've been deceived in their business transactions, especially with oil, and scammed. Everything in the Antichrist does is by deception. He's full of half-truths. A half-truth is worse than a whole lie because it's deceptive. And in her was found the blood of prophets and saints and all who were slain on the earth, talking about those who were beheaded, killed during the tribulation. All who were slain on the earth has reference to the people who will be killed during the tribulation.